late. I took a new route to get here this morning. It seems that every time I'm supposed to teach, the traffic, I don't know if it's Satan or just the way life falls, but I went around through University this morning and then cut back across 630. That was my quickest way to get here. But I made it, and I'm thankful that God always provides. I said to someone, so far, I've never not made it. So he is 100% on getting me here when I need to be here. Good to be back after a 2-week break. Actually, 3 weeks for me because I wasn't here the last time. So I hope the homework that you prepared for this week was week 6. If you didn't do week 6 this week, then you're going to be confused in small group because that's what we're going to discuss, right? Right, Kim? I'm right? Okay, so I just wanted to remind us, since we've had a little bit of a break, where we've been. The Hebrews author is basically laying out a proof, we said. A set of evidence that Jesus is better than anything that's come before him. Specifically, he's better than the beliefs, the practices associated with Judaism, with following the law, and that was just at the heart of who the Jewish people at that time were. And so we finished up in week 5 with Kim talking about the end of chapter 6, where the author really kind of takes a break in this laying of evidence and stops and calls them out for immaturity. And that's what Kim talked to us about, what it means to move from immaturity into growth. And so we took a break like they did and looked at the symptoms and signs of being immature and what it means to be mature. And so I want to remind you of the final verses of Hebrews 6, 19 through 20. And I think I have those, yeah. We have this hope as an anchor for the soul, firm and secure. It enters the inner sanctuary behind the curtain where our forerunner, Jesus, has entered on our behalf. He has become the high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And so that's what kind of sets the stage for where we're headed today. In these verses, Jesus is called a high priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. And that ushers in just this next section. Now, this theme of Jesus being the perfect high priest was introduced way back in Hebrews 2. I want to show you that verse, Hebrews 2:17. It said, "For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people." So it has been mentioned several times along the way, this pointing towards the discussion of Jesus being a great high priest. And now this week we finally got there. We got to the point in Hebrews 7 where it's time to discuss it. And so if you have not heard the name Melchizedek before, you were probably not alone. Maybe you have heard it, you studied it a little bit, but it is a concept that is not typically taught on and brought up. One of the things I saw as I was studying, somebody named it, their talk was chapter 7 of Hebrews, or the one everybody skips, because it's kind of weird and complicated and nobody quite knows what to do with it. So we are going to try to break that down this morning. I feel like a huge task is put before me. Thankfully, I got 2 weeks to study, and let me tell you, there is a multitude of information to study on this topic. It is deep. I cannot do it justice in the time we have this morning, but I do want to get our brains turning towards what this Melchizedek means. So what does it mean that Jesus is our high priest? Why was it so important for them to understand? And what in the world does that have to do with Melchizedek? That's what we're going to talk about this morning. I do want to mention that I'm drawing on 3 sources heavily this morning. Sometimes when you study, you just think, you know what, these people did it better than I could ever do it. So my technique is kind of to take from each one of them, and I just want to mention their names. One is Jen Wilkin. I did watch her teaching video for this. You know, she kept saying, we'll talk about it in the video, we'll talk about it in the video, and I was like, okay, I'm watching the video. So a lot comes from her. Also, Tim Mackey's Bible Project, I think Carissa had mentioned, or she had to me anyway. Deep studies, and just a really neat guy if you want to know more about this, that you can go to and watch some podcasts, listen to some podcasts, or watch some videos. And the last one, and I just stumbled upon this in the last couple of days, is John MacArthur has some teaching on Hebrews 7 that is unbelievable. I mean, after I found his, I thought, why didn't I just take that teaching and read it to you? It's so good. So I'm going to try to mesh and meld and grab from all those places this morning so that we get some kind of a handle on what it means for Jesus to be a great high priest. The first thing I wanted to say about that is that we are at a cultural disadvantage when talking about priests, right? As we come to this discussion of priesthood, Melchizedek, we need to realize that this is not something familiar to us. Now, if you grew up in certain faiths, the idea of a priest would be a little bit more familiar. But from my Baptist background growing up, talking about priest, experiencing priest was not something that was done on a weekly or daily basis for us. So there is a gap in understanding for us versus them in the hearing of this. They were familiar with priests. The temple was still standing. They were coming into contact with priests daily, weekly. It was a common part of their lives. So for Jesus to be our great high priest, I mean, the background question sits of, does this matter to us? Because we're not living in this priestly culture. And yes, it does, and we're going to discover how. I do want to review just a little bit what a priest is, because I don't want to assume that everybody in here has a huge background of teaching or study in what a priest did back in the day. I want to refer to Hebrews 5:1, which basically sets it out. I mean, we passed over this in our study. It says, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. So if we took that as a definition of what is a priest, 1, they're selected from among the people. 2, appointed to represent the people in matters related to God. And the third thing they do is offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, straight from the scripture, what the priest role was. So they were basically a group of people that mediated, right? That went between God and humans. They acted on behalf of the people to connect them to God. If you remember how the priesthood got started, I mean, Adam and Eve in the garden walked with God. They did not need a mediator. But as soon as sin came in, they were separated from God, and all of a sudden this gap existed that needed to be filled. So God immediately, we know, kicked off a plan to ultimately reunite human beings with himself through Jesus. But in the meantime, he set up some systems along the way where he would interact with certain men to kind of be the go-between as his plan was unfolding, to bridge that gap. He established covenants with them along the way, agreements, promises, and there was always this go-between person that would mediate. Now, we know when Moses came along, he received special instructions from God, special instructions that Israel was supposed to live by. We call it the law. It's the backdrop for Hebrews 7 to understand the law and what it meant to the people. The law contained all kinds of rules, ceremonial instructions, blueprints for the tabernacle, and a detailed system that told what these men called priests would do in this system to mediate between man and God. The priest would come from the tribe of Levi, and specifically the family of Aaron. So when we talk about the Levitical priesthood, that was that priesthood set up under the law, and they all came from the tribe of Levi. They all came from the same lineage, and they would serve to go to God on man's behalf in a specific way that would cover the sin of the Israelite people. So the purpose of the priest was not just to mediate, but also to serve this role of taking away sin, because once it came in, it separated us. And so God set up this system where they offered animal sacrifices to take away sin. They were specifically trained to fulfill their duties, and this is one thing Jen Wilkin included that I didn't know. She said at age 25, they started service in the temple, and they would start just serving their brothers for 5 years. Then at age 30, they began full duties in the temple, and at age 50, they retired. So I guess they considered when you got to 50, you had done all you could do and you were starting to decline. That's right where I'm at. So it's interesting that they stopped serving at that point. But just think, in this lineage, there was always these young people coming up. So they just had a fresh crop constantly of priests. I want us to really concentrate on the fact that the priests were specially qualified and specially trained to deal with an area of brokenness. They were specialists in this area. God placed them to deal with special area of brokenness. Tim Mackey talked about comparing it to a car and how he would take his car in if it was broken to a mechanic. For me, I thought about times when I've had illnesses, right? As long as I'm healthy, I don't think about needing anybody else. I go along fine. But as soon as there's a problem, as soon as there's an area of brokenness, of illness, of deficit, what do? I go to a specialist, someone specially qualified, someone specially trained to work on my behalf and bring me back to wholeness. That's what the priest did in the area of sin. Because in the case of the biblical priest and the need for a priest, what's actually broken here is humanity. I mean, the brokenness occurs in the hearts of men. We're sinful. And what needs to be fixed are those sinful hearts. So as soon as sin came into the world, human beings were separated from intimate relationship with God. We've said they couldn't interact with him any longer without a mediator who was specially chosen, specially trained to fix what was broken, to offer these sacrifices, to perform these rituals, to cover the sin. And this went on for years and generations. The priests really were the face for the Hebrew people of how they interacted with God. So this is not something that is lightly being addressed in Hebrews. This idea of the priesthood is very serious and very sacred and very vital to who the Jewish people have been so far. So we need to realize that in the case of Jesus being called a great high priest, that would have been very scandalous, very challenging to their ideas about the priesthood. For him to come along and present himself as the very Son of God and a superior high priest was basically, these words were, to me, the best thing, utterly offensive. Now, we go through here and read this like, yeah, he's the great high priest. They need to put their stuff down. But we need to realize for them, this was huge. The rituals of the priesthood were familiar and comfortable. Really, it defined them as a people. This idea of what the priest did was so much a part of who they were. So this is not like our culture where people are offended, by the tiniest of things. That's not what's happening here, and I'm afraid sometimes we feel that. This is a huge blow and challenge to something that they have held dear, something God himself ordained and that they have held sacred. We all know, even in our time, that religious traditions do not die easy, right? I grew up in one denomination, experienced another one when I got married, and I remember there being a little bit of an uproar if the order of the service was changed. Like if you took the Lord's Supper and then didn't sing 2 songs, or didn't sing a song, it was this huge deal. It's in us. It's in all of us to hang on to religious traditions. And that wasn't even ordained by God. So imagine for them how much more serious it would be for this system that has maintained and sustained them to being told to set it aside. To challenge the validity of the practices really was to risk your life. And I just had to recall Stephen in Acts, if you'll remember. He was speaking against the holy place and the law, the Holy of Holies, and pointing to Jesus. And what happened to him? He was martyred. He was killed for that. It's a huge deal that this is being brought up and that they are being asked to set it aside. To us, it's a no-brainer. We think, well, why would they choose traditional animal sacrifices over Jesus himself? Like, why would they do that? I just think that we need to realize this challenged their core beliefs. It's the author's really calling them to question the only way that they have ever had as a people to approach God himself. This was their connection to God. The only connection they had really was to send this high priest into that Holy of Holies in the tabernacle, for him to spill blood, for their sins to be covered temporarily. But that was what sustained them in relationship. So it's scandalous, it's threatening to the core of who they are. He's telling them that everything about the old way they've connected with God is inferior and needs to be set aside. And I started here this morning because I think we need to have some empathy for the people that we're reading about and not just assume that we would be different. Part of this, when we started, we said Hebrews was written because there was this persecution and they would be not be persecuted if they went back to the old ways. And that is true, but there's a heavy part of them going back to the old ways that was because that's how they knew to connect to God. So it's not just that they were avoiding persecution. It's that they're being asked to lay aside everything they know as far as their relationship with him. So, in light of what's at stake here, it's serious for this audience. We're going to move into Hebrews chapter 7. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we got in the homework, and Melchizedek was our main topic. We wondered, well, who is he? What's the big deal about him? And why is this whole chapter of Hebrews basically about him? I just wanted to recall, she did this in the homework, but I wanted to put it on the screen and just make sure we kind of have it so that when we think about Melchizedek in the future, we kind of know that he's mentioned in Scripture in 3 places. And you read these this week. We're not going to go back through all of them. But Genesis 14, 18 through 20, that was the historical part, the background of the story of Melchizedek and Abraham. Also, the first time the word priest is used. I thought that was interesting. Then in Psalm 110:4, we have a prophetic section about Melchizedek. It shows his connection to the Messiah that is to come. He's mentioned as a type that is just a setting for what is to come, so it's prophetic. And then in Hebrews 5, mentioned in 5 and 6, and then fully in chapter 7, we have that connection of Melchizedek to Jesus that we unfolded this week. This section describes the supremacy of Jesus as the great high priest, and it uses Melchizedek to illustrate Jesus' role as priest and king, and that he is a different kind of high priest. Chapter 7 of Hebrews discusses more about Melchizedek than any of the other sections of the Bible. And the goal of Hebrews 7 is to draw parallels between Melchizedek and Jesus in order to prove, remember this is all about proving, Melchizedek is there to draw parallels to prove that Jesus is a greater high priest. Now, Jen Wilkin went section by section. This is not how I normally do this, but that's what we're going to do. We're just going to run through this so that we have covered this heavily. We kind of get what there is about Melchizedek, and we're ready to move forward into the next section of study. So who was Melchizedek, and why was he important? And what does he tell us about Jesus as a high priest? Okay, right off the bat in Hebrews 7, 1 through 3, we find out who he was. I'm going to read that. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of the Most High God. He met Abraham, returning from defeat of the kings, and blessed him. And Abraham gave him 1/10 of everything. First, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life, resembling the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Super simple, right? Says it all right there. Okay, a couple of things seem pretty simple, and we're kind of seeing what the connection is with Jesus. The first one is king of Salem, which is another word for Jerusalem, means king of peace. So that part of his name means king of peace. The name Melchizedek itself means king of righteousness. And the third big thing about him we see is that he's a priest of God Most High. Obvious parallels right off the bat, right? King of peace, king of righteousness, and a priest of God Most High. Okay, we're not questioning that. Matches up with Jesus. But I think we need to stop and consider what it means that Melchizedek was a priest of God Most High. So this is pre-Abraham having sons, pre-tribes, pre-Aaron, all that doesn't exist at this point where Abraham interacts with Melchizedek. And he's called a priest of God Most High. Now, it was new to me to think that someone before Abraham, someone before Moses, someone before all that was called a priest of God Most High. To think that God interacted, called out, had mediation with other men along the way. I mean, that was a new thought for me. You guys maybe already knew that about Melchizedek, that this existed. But he was not just a worshiper or follower of the true God. He had been given the title and the role of being a priest of the Most High God by God himself. Remember, God chooses priests. He was a real priest of God Most High. Another important fact about him is that he was a priest, but he was not from the line of Levi. And we're going to keep talking about that as we go. But that's an important fact about him, is that he did not fall into the Levitical priest lineage. And also it said he was resembling Jesus in that he was a priest forever. And that word resembling means, I also think it's interesting, he resembles Jesus, not Jesus resembles him, right? Even though he's mentioned in the Bible first. He resembles Jesus. That word means he's made like a copy or a facsimile. I thought was a funny way to think about it. So how did he resemble Jesus? Well, one way is in his lineage, and these are really confusing words that we're going to look at next. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning or end of life. What does that mean? Does it mean he had no parents, no family line, he wasn't born, he didn't die? Is it literal or figurative is basically the argument here. And the argument is heavy on both sides. So if it's literal, then many people believe that Melchizedek was an actual manifestation of Jesus himself to Abraham. That's called a Christophany or a theophany, if you ever see that word, where maybe Jesus himself appeared. Most agree that is not the case, that it's to be taken figuratively. Now, listen to this quote. It said, if the description of Melchizedek is figurative, then the details of having no genealogy, no beginning or ending, and a ceaseless ministry are simply statements accentuating the mysterious nature of the person who met Abraham. In this case, the silence in the Genesis account concerning these details is purposeful and better serves to link Melchizedek with Christ. Another said, the author of Hebrews is building an argument from the strange silence of Genesis. I mean, obviously this was a real man who had parents and was born and died. But because of the way he appears in the story with Abraham, the way he's in and out, it's as if he had no beginning, no end, and he was appointed out of not the line of Levi. So he's a mysterious priest figure. And we're just given a snapshot of the story of Melchizedek. I mean, I know as we went, you probably thought like I did, that's all there is about him. But the audience of Hebrews, I mean, this would have been a familiar part of their story, of what was passed along as their history. If you notice, the author doesn't have to sit here forever and prove that Melchizedek was a great priest and that he meant something. He's able to mention him and move on because they knew how important he was. They had been taught about him and they understood his significance. So the author quickly moves on, whereas we would sit here for a while probably in camp and try to figure this man out. And the next thing we see from the verses was that Melchizedek blesses Abraham and he receives tithes from Abraham. And this is probably the most important part for this priest argument that we're in the middle of. The story behind this is that some kings were at war and they ended up taking Abraham's nephew Lot and his family captive when they raided Sodom, which was where Lot was living. So Abraham takes 318 soldiers, defeats the kings, recovers all the goods, saves Lot and his family, and brings them back. Now, as he's coming back from the battle, that's where the story with Melchizedek, this, just a few verses, tells us what happened. Melchizedek came out to meet him. It said he had bread and wine. He blessed Abraham, and Abraham gave Melchizedek a tenth of what he had recovered. Okay, so for us, I'm kind of like, nothing to see here, right? I mean, that doesn't mean, this happened. But why is it such a big deal for the Jews? I mean, this is a key point about this high priest argument. By establishing that Abraham recognized Melchizedek as a priest of God, received a blessing from him, bread and wine also, and then tithed to him, the author of Hebrews is setting up a proof of logical thinking to lead them to the conclusion that Jesus is our great high priest. If the priesthood they value is the Levitical priesthood, and he is asking them to lay that aside, he has to prove that there's a greater priesthood. And that happens by talking about Melchizedek, who was a great high priest who was honored by Father Abraham, right? Was blessed by him and tithed to him. So I'm going to stretch to my old math roots here, and we're going to talk about this being a proof. Do you remember in math how you had to go like, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C? Okay, that's what the author's doing here. And it goes like this. If Jesus is the same kind of priest as Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, and you're blank, you put that greater than sign, taking you back. then Jesus' priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. I mean, this is the gist of what's going on in Hebrews 7. If Jesus is the same kind of priest as Melchizedek, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham, then Jesus' priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. I have to stop and tell you that when I had her make this slide, she had the spot for you to fill in, and I was a math major for a while and just a nerd in that area. And so when she put it up, it looked like greater than or equal to. You know how if you have both? And I had to say, I can't stand it. I can't put up there that it looks like that Melchizedek and Abraham are equal, or that the priesthood are equal. So that's why we went back to that, and I felt like the pickiest person. But I'm like, he's greater than, they're greater than. It can't be equal to. It has to be greater than. So as we move forward into Hebrews 7, 4 through 10 kind of tells us how. The part of how if Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. So we talked a little bit about it. The text finishes it out. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave him a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who became priests to collect a tenth from the people. That is from their fellow Israelites, even though they are also descended from Abraham. This man, however, Melchizedek, did not trace his descent from Levi. Yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had the promises. And without doubt, the lesser is blessed by the greater. He doesn't want them to miss that. Who's the lesser? Yes, who's the greater? Melchizedek. Melchizedek was the greater. He was the priest of the Most High God. He blessed the lesser, Abraham. In the one case, the tenth is collected by people who die, but in the other case, by him who is declared to be living. One might even say that Levi, who collects the tenth, paid the tenth through Abraham, because when Melchizedek met Abraham, Levi was still in the body of his ancestor. Interesting thinking here, but in their thinking, without all the medical science that we have to know how people are made and born and genetics, their idea was that a man's descendants were inside of him waiting to be placed inside a woman to be born. So you had all your descendants inside of you, or at least the men did, I guess, waiting for those to be born. So to them, Levi's inside Abraham, even though he doesn't even exist yet. When Abraham is blessed by Melchizedek and Abraham gives tithes, Levi's inside of Abraham. So that means that Levi also was blessed by Melchizedek and gave tithes to him. They need to believe this. This is important. Even to us, we're like, okay, they have to see that Melchizedek is greater. They have to see that the covenant that was made with Abraham, that the law that was laid out with Moses is inferior, that there's something greater. They have to get it. So the therefore in this part, we've talked about therefores in Hebrew so much. The therefore is the then, that Jesus' priesthood is greater than the Levitical priesthood. And that is the ultimate point the author's trying to make. Because if they don't believe that to be true, then there's no way that they're going to stop going to the temple and having sacrifices offered on their behalf. They have to believe he's a better high priest. The author is making an appeal really to the intellectual objections that they would have had in accepting Jesus as the final high priest. They had these intellectual hang-ups where they couldn't bridge the gap between what they knew and what was being said, and that's what he's trying to do. In order for the Hebrew audience to fully follow Jesus, they must believe Jesus is a greater high priest than the line of Levitical priest and the law. Otherwise, like I said, they're never going to lay down the sacrificial system. And part of that, which has to do with Melchizedek, is that they have to believe Jesus is of a different priestly order. Because if he's of the order of Levi, what does that mean? He's going to die, right? He's temporary. So he can't be from that line. But if he's not from that line, they don't respect that he's a priest. Unless he's a priest of the order of Melchizedek, which they do respect as being greater than all that. This is confusing and simple all at the same time. And we are going to circle the same thing over and over and over through the rest of the chapter. So we're going to move fast. If you want to open your books back to where the scripture is in Hebrews 7, we're just going to kind of look at a verse and see what it means. Look at a verse, see what it means, because that's what the Hebrew author, he is hitting with a lot of punches right now. He is piling evidence upon evidence for them, proof upon proof in the rest of chapter 7. I thought about this. One of my 16-year-old the other night after homecoming wanted to stay out later than we normally let her. And so as soon as she gave me that text, I've got this reason and that reason and that reason, and I want her to hear all of those before she gets a chance to come back. And that's how this section kind of needs to be read. It is proof upon proof upon proof. When your mind starts to go, well, what about this? He comes in with the next thing. So we're going to start in verse 11. And I'm going to read from the NIV just because I think it's good to hear different words than what you studied all week, but it'll match. So verse 11 says, if perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, and indeed the law given to the people established that priesthood, why was there still a need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek, not in the order of Aaron? What are they saying there? The Levitical priesthood never made anything perfect, right? Because of why? The qualities we've already discussed. The men are sinful, they're limited by death, they have to offer sacrifices over and over. Why would God even make a different order of priest? The order of Melchizedek, remember, prophetically said in Psalm 110, this is coming. Why would he have even said that if the Levitical priesthood was entirely sufficient? There'd be no need for another priesthood. They must face that the existing system is insufficient. And here's a thought I want us to start with and carry. The system only treats sin. It does not cure it. Verses 12 through 14. For when the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed also. He of whom these things are said belonged to a different tribe, and no one from that tribe has ever served at the altar. For it is clear that our Lord descended from Judah, and in regard to that tribe, Moses said nothing about priest. He's addressing this intellectual idea they have that we can't respect him as a priest. Why? Because he's not from the line of Levi. The idea of change here, saying the priesthood is changed, the law must be changed, is a word that means to put one thing in the place of another. So you don't add Christianity to Judaism. You don't add Jesus to the Levitical priesthood. This word change means one thing is set aside, taken away, and actually replaced with a new thing. They don't exist together. So not only is he saying to the Jews, there's a new priest, he's saying when the new priest comes, the old system has to go as well, right? The law must be changed also. So if they're going to accept Jesus as a great high priest, a new high priest, a better high priest, it's bigger than just saying, yes, they accept that. They have to put the whole old system aside. He's basically saying to them, you don't have to keep going back to the temple. You don't need to keep having sacrifices put on your behalf. You have to accept him as the full cure for your sin problem. Verses 15 through 17. And what we have said is even more clear if another priest like Melchizedek appears, one who's become a priest not on the basis of regulation as to his ancestry, but on the basis of the power of an indestructible life. For it is declared, you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Again, calling out their intellectual objections, right? He's already gotten them to admit, when they read that they respected Melchizedek as being a great high priest, greater than Abraham. So now he's asking them to set aside this Levitical lineage that they've counted on for their priesthood. He's pulled from their own history. He's walked them step by step through logical thinking. He pointed to the Psalm 110 prophecy, which they recognize as true. And now he's pulling them to come to the conclusion that Jesus offers a superior position as high priest because he is one of the same type as Melchizedek. So that word order or type, John MacArthur said a biblical type doesn't have to be a type in every respect, because obviously we're looking at Melchizedek and we're looking at Jesus, and he resembles Jesus, but it's not an exact match, right? So he said, we say, for example, that a lamb in the Old Testament is a type of Christ. Not in every respect, in one respect. I mean, it's a sacrifice, right? Aaron is a type of Christ in his function. Melchizedek is a type of Christ in his person. I'm going to say that again. I know this is a whole bunch of information, but it's good. Aaron is a type of Christ in his functioning as a priest. Melchizedek is a type of Christ in his person, a priest forever. Not all types have to be types in every respect. So Christ really fulfills the type of Aaron and Melchizedek. He fulfills Aaron's type in function and Melchizedek's type in person. And that's what makes him perfect, the perfect high priest and superior. Okay, the building, the proof upon proof. He really starts bringing it home now. So verses 18 and 19. The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. For the law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced by which we draw near to God. This was a big statement. Remember the scandal. Remember the utter offense at what's being said here. The former regulation is set aside, the law, the old priesthood system, because it was weak and useless, because it made nothing perfect. The law cannot perfect anyone, right? It only points out sin. We've talked about it over and over. While the law sets God's perfect standard, it gives me no power to keep that standard. That's what's wrong with the Levitical priesthood. The author is not saying the law isn't valuable. The principles and the standards that we know of what God wants and expects for his people is not valuable. He's saying that law, that system of priests has no power to fix our sin problem. Verses 20 through 22, more proof. And it was not without an oath. Others became priests without any oath, but he became a priest with an oath when God said to him, "The Lord has sworn and will not change his mind. You are a priest forever." Because of this oath, Jesus has become the guarantor of a better covenant. What is the oath? It's God's authority to appoint Jesus as a high priest forever, even though he was not born in that lineage of the Levitical priesthood. The Levitical priests were appointed by what? Heredity, right? They just had to be born into the right family. Jesus was appointed because of who he is, his character, his perfection. God appointed him as a priest forever. I thought this was a good statement in just the difference between the high priests that were men and the high priest of Jesus. It said the norm or the standard prescribed for the high priest in the old economy had to do only with the body, only with the physical. It didn't matter what they were spiritually. It had nothing to do with it. To be a priest, you had to be a pure descendant of Aaron. And on top of that, there was 142 at least physical blemishes that could disqualify you. It was physical, all physical. Those were the only disqualifications. If you made it through as a physical specimen, it didn't matter what you were spiritually, you were in. That's who they were counting on to fix their sin problem, to treat their sin problem. He goes on to say in verse 22 that Jesus is the guarantor of a better covenant. A guarantor pays a debt, right, if a debtor defaults. How many people defaulted under the law? Every person. How many people could the Levitical priest pay the debt for? None. They were sinful themselves. All these things that have been said throughout Hebrews are just coming together here. Verses 23 through 25. Now there have been many of those priests since death prevented them from continuing in office. But because Jesus lives forever, he has a permanent priesthood. Therefore, he's able to save completely those who come to God through him because he always lives to intercede for them. He's saying Jesus is able to do what the many priests before him were not able to accomplish. He's called out the weakness of that priesthood. Death always ends that man's run. But Jesus is not restricted by death. He doesn't need to be replaced, and he's not just a temporary fix for our sin problem. This is the next point on your outline. As our great high priest, Jesus is able to save us to the uttermost. Didn't you love those words this week? That means completely, perfectly, and eternally. Completely, perfectly, and eternally. From David Guzik's study guide for Hebrews, he said this: the unchanging nature of Jesus' priesthood means that the salvation he gives is also unchanging, permanent, and secure. Most people read the verse as if it said Jesus is able to save from the uttermost, but it really says Jesus is able to save to the uttermost. Because he is our high priest forever, he can save forever. There's really a transition at this point of the author saying, this is more than just me proving that proof we laid out before. This is about Jesus being perfect and able to usher in a cure when you're willing to settle for the treatment. He is able to bring perfection. Now, we see that word in the Bible a lot, and when Paul used the term perfection, it usually meant mature, complete, full-grown, talking about growing in maturity. But in Hebrews, this word is used to refer to the goal and the aim of Christianity, which is access to God. He's able to bring us completely, perfectly, and eternally into access with God, what the Levitical priesthood could never do. It has to do with our salvation. The Levitical priesthood could only cover sins. The old covenant covered them over, but it never got rid of them. Verses 26 through 28 close the chapter, and it's basically a summary of what the author has been saying in this idea of proving Jesus' superiority as a high priest. Such a high priest truly meets our need, one who is holy, blameless, pure, set apart from sinners, exalted above the heavens. Unlike the other high priest, he does not need to offer sacrifices day after day, first for his own sins and then for the sins of the people. He sacrificed for their sins once for all when he offered himself. For the law appoints as high priests men in all their weakness, but the oath, which came after the law, appointed the Son, who's been made perfect forever. He brings it home in these verses, and he says, right off the bat, holy, blameless, pure, set apart. But you need to think about the other side of that. When he says holy, he's saying he is holy versus unholy, which is the Levitical priesthood. When it said blameless, saying Jesus is innocent versus guilty, sinful priest versus a perfectly pure priest. Pure, unstained versus stained by sin that would have existed with the Levitical priest. Jesus is separated from sinners versus being a sinner himself. He's exalted in heaven versus being earthbound, being time-bound, being bound by a physical body and death. He was able to offer one sacrifice versus many sacrifices that had to be offered by the priest. The gist of this, he's a different kind of high priest than the Levite priest under the law. He is better than in every way. So the conclusion that they and we need to draw from this is that the law and its priesthood offered a treatment for sin, but Jesus brought the cure. This is what they have to get. Jesus is not just a treatment for sin, like the Levitical priest and the sacrificial system provided. For all those reasons we just went through. What the author of Hebrews is trying to get across is that what Jesus has to offer is superior in all ways to the sacrificial system the law offered. Where it offered a temporary solution, Jesus brought a permanent solution. Where their priests could only partially offer forgiveness, Jesus brought complete and eternal forgiveness. Where sacrifices had to be made over and over again, Jesus gave the sacrifice of himself once for all time. Where the law was weak and useless, Jesus was completely perfect and able to fully solve the sin problem. They had to understand he was a greater high priest. Because the most important feature in Judaism, the most important feature in the ritual of Judaism and in the ceremony of Judaism and in the law of the Old Testament was the function of the priesthood. Therefore, and this is John MacArthur speaking, if Jesus is to be superior in all ways to the Old Covenant, he must be superior to the old priesthood. We're kind of at if you think about a roller coaster, we're kind of just reaching the top as far as Hebrews goes, because what comes after this is a new covenant, the true tabernacle in heaven. Faith. All those things hinge on this, though. If they don't get this about the priesthood, they don't get the rest of it. They won't accept the new covenant if they don't get this about the priesthood. He says the great crux of the book then hinges on the priesthood of Christ, that he is a superior priest to any in the old covenant. The Jewish reader needs to understand that the new covenant is total, and it needs nothing of Judaism to make it complete. That's the summary of the whole shot in Hebrews. Christ is the better priest, the supreme priest, and therefore his provision, his sacrifice, his priesthood, and what we're going to next, his covenant, are superior to all of the old ones. He was the priest and the sacrifice, and he brought perfect redemption, which is what God intended all the way back from the beginning when we lost that relationship with him in Eden, when this whole system got kicked off. Hebrews 7 is calling the Jewish believers to set aside what was now obsolete. And if you think about it, it's actually merciful that the author is calling them to this, because what's going to happen in 70 AD? The temple will fall. The sacrificial system will never be restored. And if that is what they are counting on, there is a hard, hard day coming, and they are going to have to face this at some point. They need to get it now. So we started this week by talking about the need for a priest, for an individual qualified to fix what's broken. And we said it could be our car, it could be our bodies. And as we studied this week, we may have thought this all kind of seemed like a Jewish issue, right? I mean, we're kind of watching what they are doing and hearing. But what we need to realize this morning is that we have a lot in common with the audience of Hebrews, right? We're all broken. We all need a cure. Underneath this assumption of Jesus being the great high priest for them and for us is that we all need a priest. Not just they needed a priest because they lived in that system. We also need a priest. We need a Savior. We're so broken that we cannot do for ourselves what needs to be done. They were so broken they could not do for themselves what needed to be done. We need more than a treatment for sin. We need a remedy. And isn't that the heart of the gospel? This recognizing Jesus as great high priest? That he brings a remedy for this sin problem that goes way back, but is still so rampant. I think that what we've been through over the last couple of years gives us a little perspective on this. I started thinking and then realized it connected to what we've been through. I thought, imagine a worldwide pandemic, something that poses a threat to every human being on the globe. Well, we've kind of experienced that, but did we realize that there's a really even bigger pandemic that exists, and that's we have sinful hearts. We have a disease that's without a cure. There's fear and desperation in realizing that we have a level of brokenness that cannot be fixed. We need a priest. We need a mediator to go before a holy and perfect God on our behalf to bridge the gap that exists between us and him because of our sin. Surely they at this point, and surely we at this point, are convinced that Jesus is that perfect high priest. We look at them and think, why would they not want the cure? Why would they want the treatment? But we may live that way too. I can only imagine for someone coming to know Christ, what a strange thing it must be to think that this man wants to change everything about me. And that's scary, and that's sometimes hard to take on. I just want to finish up by reading from John MacArthur's, it's Jesus the Superior Priest, if you wanted to look it up. And he's talking about Hebrews 7:18 through 19, and that verse said, "The former regulation is set aside because it was weak and useless. The law made nothing perfect, and a better hope is introduced, by which we draw near to God." And I just want you to listen to his words as we finish. He said, there's a phrase I want you to get. We draw near unto God. That's the key to the whole thing. The goal of God in all that he does on behalf of man is that man might come into his presence. Drawing near to God is the goal of Christianity. That's the whole point. This is the essence of Christianity. This is its highest experience. This is the design of God for Christianity, access to his presence, coming into his presence with nothing between. And I think sometimes we forget this. Christians look at their Christian life usually in three or at least three ways. Some look at their Christian life and they see Jesus Christ only as a means to salvation and personal happiness. And that's about how they look at their Christian life. They're looking for happiness. They're on a quest for security. They found Jesus. There's their happiness. There's their security. And that's about as far as it ever goes. Other people look at their Christian life like this. They see it as a relationship to Jesus Christ, and they seek to know Christ better. Now that's fine, just as number one was fine, but still they haven't grasped really what Christianity is. It's not just security and happiness. It's not just knowing Jesus Christ deeper and deeper. Thirdly, and this is the key, this is what Christianity really is. Some Christians understand that Christianity is drawing nigh unto God. That is the essence of Christianity. That's what it is. The fullest expression of our faith is to enter into the presence of God, into the Holy of Holies, and to sit on the throne with Him. That's the fullest expression of our faith. Jesus is the door to God. And in a sense, many Christians fellowship with the door and never get into the Holy of Holies. We need to understand that the design of God in our faith is to bring us into a full kind of access to the God of the universe. Now, friends, that is something that Judaism could never do. I hope that this morning and this week, as you've considered Jesus as the high priest, that you cross over into really valuing him as your high priest. And that you would respond, as I have, kind of as I've dug into this the last 2 weeks, with just a sense of gratitude and humility, and also celebration and joy that that veil was torn, that we have full access to God. We live in a great time. We didn't have to lay aside animal sacrifices. We didn't have to struggle with that. We live in the fullness of the great high priest. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much that you are the great high priest, that you are the cure for the sin problem that we all have. And I pray that this morning you just help us to realize truly how broken we were, but truly how fully healed we are because of you. And I pray that we would rejoice in the idea that we have full access to God, and that we would exercise that full access and live to the fullness of what you've intended for us as your people. Be with us in our discussions in small group. Help us cement this idea and help it to change our hearts. In Jesus' name I pray, amen.